A barefoot 10-year-old boy raised his hand to save a dying horse that had already defeated every doctor, healer, and expert in the country, and the wealthy crowd erupted in cruel laughter. Within hours, that same crowd would stand in stunned silence as the millionaire dropped to his knees and signed over his entire fortune. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The estate of Don Ricardo Montoya was known throughout the region as a place where dreams either came true or died trying. Nestled in the heart of the Mexican countryside, the sprawling hacienda stretched across thousands of acres of fertile land, its whitewashed walls gleaming under the relentless sun like a beacon of wealth and power. For decades, Don Ricardo had built his empire through shrewd business dealings, cattle trading, and above all, his legendary horses. But on this particular morning, as the dust settled over the central corral and the air hung heavy with tension, everyone knew that something was terribly wrong. The horse lying in the center of the arena was no ordinary animal. Relampago, which meant lightning in Spanish, was a magnificent chestnut stallion whose coat shimmered like burnished copper in the sunlight. He had won more races than anyone could count, brought more prestige to the Montoya name than any business deal ever could, and was valued at a sum that most people in the surrounding villages could not even comprehend. But now, Relampago lay on his side in the dirt, his powerful body reduced to a trembling mass of muscle and bone, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps that seemed to drain the hope from everyone who watched. Don Ricardo stood at the edge of the corral, his face a mask of barely contained anguish. At 63 years old, he had weathered countless storms, both literal and figurative. He had survived droughts that killed his cattle, economic downturns that nearly bankrupted him, and the loss of his beloved wife to illness 5 years prior. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the sight of his most treasured companion lying in the dust, dying by inches, while the best veterinarians in the country stood by helplessly, shaking their heads with grim expressions. The veterinarians had come from everywhere. Don Ricardo had spared no expense, summoning specialists from Mexico City, from Guadalajara, even from across the border in the United States. They had examined Relampago with every tool at their disposal, drawn blood samples, administered medications, and consulted with one another in hushed, urgent tones. But their verdict had been unanimous and devastating. The stallion was suffering from a rare condition that affected his nervous system, causing his muscles to weaken progressively, until eventually his heart would simply give out. There was no known cure. There was nothing to be done but wait for the inevitable. But Don Ricardo was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had not built his fortune by surrendering to circumstances, and he was not about to start now. So he had done something that shocked everyone who knew him. He had issued a public declaration, spreading the word through every village, town, and city within 100 miles. Whoever could cure Relampago, whoever could save his beloved horse from death, would inherit his entire estate. His land, his cattle, his businesses, his home, everything he had spent a lifetime building would belong to the person who could accomplish what seemed impossible. The announcement had caused an uproar. People talked of nothing else in the marketplaces and cantinas. Some thought Don Ricardo had lost his mind to grief. Others saw it as a desperate gamble by a man who had nothing left to lose. But whatever their opinions, they came. They came by the dozens at first, then by the hundreds. Healers, herbalists, self-proclaimed miracle workers, and charlatans of every description made their way to the Montoya estate, each one convinced that they held the secret to saving Relampago. The corral had become a stage for this parade of hopefuls. One by one they approached the fallen stallion, applied their remedies, chanted their prayers, and performed their rituals. One man brought crystals that he claimed had been blessed by an ancient shaman. A woman arrived with a potion made from rare plants found only in the deepest jungles. Another man insisted that the horse was possessed by evil spirits and attempted to perform an exorcism that left everyone more confused than before. Each one failed. Each one walked away with their heads hanging low, their dreams of wealth and prosperity crumbling like dust in the wind. Don Ricardo watched each attempt with diminishing hope. The lines on his face grew deeper with every passing day, and his once proud bearing began to stoop under the weight of his grief. His foreman, a weathered man named Joaquin, who had worked for the family for over 30 years, stood beside him throughout the ordeal. Joaquin had seen many things in his life, but nothing quite like this. Nothing like watching a proud man slowly break apart as his most beloved companion slipped closer to death with each passing hour. On this particular morning, a week after the announcement had been made, the crowd gathered around the corral was larger than ever. Word had spread that Relámpago was growing weaker, that his time was running out. Those who had not yet tried their hand at saving him hurried to the estate, desperate to claim the prize before it was too late. Those who had already failed returned to watch, drawn by morbid curiosity, or perhaps by some faint hope that someone, somehow, would succeed where they had not. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the temperature rose with it. The men in the crowd, many of them wearing the wide-brimmed hats typical of the region, shifted their weight from foot to foot, wiping sweat from their brows and muttering among themselves. Some cast skeptical glances at the latest batch of hopefuls who were lining up to present their credentials to Don Ricardo. A healer from Oaxaca claimed to have cured a horse with similar symptoms using ancient Zapotec medicine. A veterinarian from Texas spoke of experimental treatments that had shown promise in laboratory settings. A priest offered to perform a blessing that he insisted would invoke divine intervention. But as each of them approached Relámpago, as each of them examined the stallion and attempted their various remedies, the result was always the same. The horse remained on the ground, his once bright eyes now dull with pain and exhaustion, his magnificent body growing weaker by the hour. The crowd grew restless, their initial excitement giving way to a collective sense of despair. Perhaps there truly was no hope. Perhaps Don Ricardo would have to accept what everyone else had already begun to accept, that Relámpago was going to die, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. It was at this moment, when hope seemed to have all but vanished, that something unexpected happened, something that would change everything. At the edge of the crowd, barely visible among the legs of the adults who towered over him, a small figure began to push his way forward. He was just a boy, no more than 10 years old, with dusty clothes that had seen better days and bare feet that were caked with the red dirt of the countryside. His hair was unkempt, his face smudged with grime, and his appearance was so unremarkable that most people did not even notice him at first. The boy's name was Mateo, and he had walked for 3 days to reach the Montoya estate. He had heard about Don Ricardo's announcement from a traveling merchant who had stopped at the small village where Mateo lived with his grandmother. The merchant had spoken of the dying horse and the incredible reward being offered, shaking his head at the foolishness of a rich man who would give away everything for an animal. But Mateo had listened with a different kind of attention. He had felt something stir deep within his chest, a pull that he could not explain, but could not ignore either. Mateo's grandmother had raised him since he was an infant, after his parents had died in a flood that swept through their village during a terrible storm. She was a small woman with hands gnarled by years of hard work and eyes that seemed to see things others could not. People in the village called her a curandera, a healer who used herbs and prayers and ancient knowledge passed down through generations to treat the sick. But she always insisted that she was nothing special, just an old woman who paid attention to the world around her and listened to what it had to teach. It was his grandmother who had taught Mateo everything he knew about animals. From the time he could walk, he had accompanied her on her rounds, watching as she treated the livestock of their neighbors, the chickens and goats and donkeys that were the lifeblood of their small community. She had shown him how to read the signs of illness in an animal's eyes, how to feel for fever in their ears, how to listen to the rhythm of their breathing and understand what it meant. Most importantly, she had taught him that healing was not just about herbs and medicines. It was about connection. It was about understanding. It was about love. When Mateo told his grandmother that he wanted to go to the Montoya estate, she had looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Her dark eyes, clouded with age but still sharp as ever, seemed to peer into his very soul. Then she had nodded slowly and pressed a small leather pouch into his hands. Inside were dried herbs, carefully selected and prepared, along with a piece of paper covered in her spidery handwriting. Instructions, she said, and a prayer. She had kissed his forehead and told him to trust his heart, and then she had watched him walk away down the dusty road, her frail figure growing smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared from view. Now, standing at the edge of the crowd, Matteo felt his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The men around him were so tall, so imposing, their voices loud and confident as they discussed the dying horse and the futility of trying to save it. He felt small and insignificant, a grain of sand on a vast beach. But the pull he had felt back in his village was stronger than ever now, drawing him forward like an invisible thread connecting his heart to the fallen stallion in the center of the corral. He began to push his way through the crowd, squeezing between bodies, ducking under elbows, muttering apologies that no one seemed to hear. Some of the men glanced down at him with annoyance, shoving him aside or stepping on his bare feet without a second thought. But Matteo kept moving, kept pushing, until finally he emerged at the front of the crowd, standing at the wooden fence that surrounded the corral. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Relampago was even more magnificent than he had imagined, even in his weakened state. The stallion's coat, though dulled by illness, still held hints of its former brilliance. His mane, tangled and matted with sweat, spread across the dirt like a dark river. But it was the horse's eyes that captured Matteo completely. They were large and dark, filled with a pain that seemed to go beyond the physical, a sadness that spoke of a spirit being slowly crushed by forces it could not understand or fight. Matteo's hand reached out instinctively, his small fingers wrapping around the wooden rail of the fence. He wanted to go to the horse, wanted to touch him and comfort him, and tell him that everything would be all right. But before he could move, a rough hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. It was one of Don Ricardo's workers, a burly man with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes. "What do you think you're doing here, boy?" the man demanded. "This is no place for children. Go back to wherever you came from before you get hurt." Matteo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His voice seemed to have abandoned him, lost somewhere in the overwhelming presence of all these adults who towered over him like giants. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back furiously, refusing to show weakness. It was then that another voice cut through the commotion, a voice that was quiet but carried an authority that silenced everyone around it. "Let him go," the voice said. "Bring him to me." The worker released Matteo's shoulder as if it had suddenly caught fire. The crowd parted, creating a path that led directly to where Don Ricardo stood at the far end of the corral. The old man was looking at Matteo with an expression that was difficult to read, his weathered face revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. Matteo walked forward on trembling legs, acutely aware of all the eyes upon him. The whispers that followed him were not kind. "What is a street urchin doing here?" someone muttered. "Does he think he can succeed where doctors and healers have failed?" another scoffed. "The boy must be mad," a third voice declared, "or perhaps simply desperate for a meal." But Matteo kept walking, his bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. He kept his eyes fixed on Don Ricardo, on the face of the man who had built an empire and was now watching it crumble because of a dying horse. When he finally stood before the old man, Matteo had to crane his neck back to look up at him. Don Ricardo seemed impossibly tall, impossibly powerful, a figure from the kind of stories that Matteo's grandmother used to tell him by the fire on cold winter nights. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen. Then Don Ricardo slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing his face level with Matteo's. Up close, Matteo could see the lines of grief etched into the old man's features, the redness around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and tears shed in private. But he could also see something else, something that looked almost like hope. "Why are you here, boy?" Don Ricardo asked softly. His voice was gentle, far gentler than Matteo had expected from such a powerful man. "What makes you think you can help my horse when everyone else has failed?" Matteo swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as the desert sand. All around him, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down upon him, skeptical and dismissive. These were grown men, educated men, men who had spent their lives studying animals and medicine and the mysteries of the natural world. And here he was, a barefoot boy from a village so small it did not appear on most maps, standing before one of the richest men in the region and claiming that he could do what all of them had failed to accomplish. But when Mateo looked into Don Ricardo's eyes, he did not see mockery or contempt. He saw something that reminded him of his grandmother, a willingness to listen, a recognition that wisdom did not always come from expected sources. And so he found his voice, small and trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word. "My grandmother is a healer," Mateo began. "She has taught me since I was very young how to care for animals. She says that sickness is not always in the body. Sometimes it is in the spirit. Sometimes an animal gives up because it has lost something important, something that made it want to live. She says that to heal the body, you must first heal the heart." A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. "The boy speaks of fairy tales," someone called out. "Does he think this is some kind of children's story where love conquers all?" Another voice joined in, harsher than the first. "Send him away, Don Ricardo. He is wasting your time and insulting your intelligence." But Don Ricardo raised his hand, and the laughter died as quickly as it had begun. The old man's eyes never left Mateo's face, studying the boy with an intensity that made Mateo want to squirm. But he held his ground, remembering his grandmother's words. Trust your heart, she had told him, and his heart was telling him that he was exactly where he needed to be. "What else did your grandmother teach you?" Don Ricardo asked quietly. "What do you see when you look at my horse?" Mateo turned slowly and looked at Relampago. The stallion had not moved since Mateo arrived, his great body still sprawled in the dirt, his breathing shallow and labored. But as Mateo watched, something strange happened. The horse's ear twitched, turning slightly in Mateo's direction, as if the animal had somehow sensed his gaze. Then, slowly, painfully, Relampago lifted his head a few inches off the ground and looked directly at the boy. Their eyes met, and Mateo felt a shock run through his entire body, like the jolt of static electricity that came from touching metal on a dry day. But this was different. This was deeper, more profound. In that moment, Mateo felt as if he could see into the horse's very soul, could feel what Relampago was feeling. And what he felt made his heart ache with a sorrow so intense that tears sprang unbidden to his eyes. "He is not just sick," Mateo whispered, his voice barely audible. "He is sad. So deeply sad that he does not want to fight anymore. He has lost something, something precious to him. And until he finds it again, or finds something to replace it, no medicine in the world will save him." The crowd fell silent. Even those who had mocked Mateo moments before found themselves unable to speak, transfixed by the strange connection that seemed to have formed between the boy and the dying horse. Don Ricardo's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "How do you know this?" the old man asked, his voice rough with emotion. "How can you possibly know what my horse is feeling?" Mateo did not answer immediately. Instead, he climbed over the fence and dropped into their corral, ignoring the gasps of alarm from the crowd. Several of Don Ricardo's workers moved forward to stop him, but the old man waved them back with a sharp gesture. "Let him go," he commanded. "Let him approach." Mateo walked slowly toward Relampago, his bare feet making soft sounds in the dust. With each step, he could feel the horse's gaze upon him, wary but curious. The stallion had stopped lifting his head, the effort apparently too great, but his eyes followed the boy's every movement. When Mateo was close enough to touch him, he stopped and knelt down in the dirt, bringing himself to the horse's level. "Hello, Relampago," Mateo said softly. "I know you are tired. I know you are hurting. But I need you to listen to me. I need you to trust me, even though we have only just met. Can you do that?" The horse let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry all the weight of his suffering. But he did not look away from Mateo. If anything, his gaze seemed to sharpen, focusing on the boy with an intensity that it was almost human. Mateo reached out slowly and placed his hand on the horse's neck. The coat was damp with sweat, the muscles beneath it slack and weak. But Mateo could feel something else too, a faint pulse of energy, a spark of life that had not yet been completely extinguished. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. It was a foundation upon which something could be built. "I am going to help you," Matteo whispered, "but I cannot do it alone. You have to help me too. You have to want to live. You have to find a reason to keep fighting. Can you do that for me, Relampago? Can you try?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The horse lay still, his breathing unchanged, his eyes fixed on Matteo's face. The crowd watched in breathless silence, waiting for something, anything to happen. Don Ricardo stood frozen at the edge of the corral, his hands gripping the fence so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Then, almost imperceptibly, Relampago moved. It was not much, just a slight shift of his head, a tiny movement that brought his muzzle closer to Matteo's hand. But it was enough. It was a response, a sign that somewhere deep within that broken body, the stallion was still listening, still fighting. Matteo felt a smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile he had worn since leaving his grandmother's side 3 days ago. "Good boy," he murmured, stroking the horse's neck with gentle fingers. "That is all I needed to know. Now we can begin." He reached into the leather pouch his grandmother had given him and pulled out the carefully prepared herbs. The real work was about to start. The herbs that Matteo's grandmother had prepared were not ordinary remedies that could be purchased in any marketplace. They were the product of generations of knowledge, carefully guarded secrets passed down from mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild, through centuries of tradition. There was dried chamomile for calming the spirit, wild mint for soothing inflammation, and a rare root that grew only in the highest mountain valleys, known to restore strength to weakened muscles. But the most important ingredient was not in the pouch at all. It was something that could not be packaged or preserved. It was the intention behind the healing, the love and care that transformed simple plants into powerful medicine. Matteo worked with a focus and precision that belied his young age. He had watched his grandmother perform these rituals countless times, had assisted her in preparing remedies for sick animals throughout his childhood. His small hands moved with practiced ease, crushing the herbs between his fingers, releasing their fragrant oils into the air. The scent that rose from the mixture was earthy and sweet, carrying hints of the mountains and forests from which the plants had been gathered. The crowd watched in fascinated silence as the boy went about his work. Many of them had never seen anything like this before. The veterinarians and doctors who had tried to save Relampago had relied on modern medicines, on injections and pills and scientific protocols. But this boy was doing something entirely different. He was treating the horse not as a collection of symptoms to be addressed, but as a living being with a soul that needed tending. Matteo leaned close to Relampago's ear and began to whisper. No one else could hear what he was saying, but the effect on the horse was immediate and unmistakable. The stallion's ears, which had been lying flat against his head in a posture of defeat, slowly began to rise. His nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the herbs, and his eyes, which had been dull and lifeless just moments before, seemed to brighten ever so slightly. Don Ricardo watched all of this with a mixture of hope and disbelief. He had seen so many failed attempts to save his beloved horse that he had almost given up entirely. But there was something about this boy, something about the way he moved and spoke and connected with Relampago, that made the old man dare to believe in again. It was as if Matteo understood something fundamental about the horse that all the experts had missed. The whispers from the crowd had shifted in tone. Where before there had been mockery and skepticism, now there was curiosity and wonder. "Who is this boy?" people asked each other. "Where did he come from? How does he know how to do these things?" No one had answers, but everyone was watching, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. Matteo placed the crushed herbs into a small bowl and added water from a canteen he carried at his side. He stirred the mixture with his finger, creating a paste that was thick and fragrant. Then he began to apply it to specific points on Relampago's body, places where his grandmother had taught him that energy flowed and gathered, behind the ears, along the neck, at the base of the spine. With each application, he murmured words that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him, words that were not quite prayers and not quite songs, but something in between. As the minutes passed, something remarkable began to happen. Relampago's breathing, which had been shallow and labored since Mateo first arrived, started to deepen and steady. The trembling that had racked his body began to subside, replaced by a stillness that was not the stillness of death, but the stillness of peace. The horse's eyes closed, not in surrender, but in rest, as if for the first time in days he was able to truly relax. The crowd gasped as Relampago let out a long, deep sigh, his entire body seeming to release tension that had been building for weeks. Don Ricardo stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch his horse, but he stopped himself, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. Tears were streaming down the old man's face, though he seemed unaware of them. He had not cried in public since his wife's funeral, but now he could not stop the flood of emotion that overwhelmed him. Mateo continued his work, oblivious to the reactions of those around him. He was in a world of his own now, a world that contained only himself and Relampago. He could feel the horse's energy shifting beneath his hands, could sense the spark of life growing stronger with each passing moment. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The herbs and the touch and the whispered words were important, but they were not enough on their own. There was still something missing, something that Relampago needed but had not yet received. After nearly an hour of treatment, Mateo finally sat back and wiped the sweat from his forehead. The sun had climbed high in the sky, and the heat in the corral was oppressive. But the boy did not complain. He simply looked at Relampago with an expression of deep concentration, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had no obvious solution. Don Ricardo could not contain himself any longer. He climbed over the fence and approached Mateo, kneeling down beside him in the dust. "What is it?" he asked urgently. "What else does he need? Tell me and I will get it for him, whatever it costs, whatever it takes." Mateo looked up at the old man, his young face suddenly seeming much older than his years. "The herbs have helped his body," he said slowly. "His strength will return in time, but his spirit is still broken. He is missing something, something that was taken from him. Until he gets it back, he will never truly heal." Don Ricardo's face crumpled with confusion and frustration. Missing something. What could he possibly be missing? He has the best food, the finest stable, everything a horse could ever want. I have given him everything. Mateo shook his head gently. "Not everything," he said. "There is something else. Something that happened to him, something that hurt him deep inside. Do you know what it might be?" The old man fell silent, his mind racing through memories of the past months, searching for anything that might explain his horse's mysterious decline. And then suddenly his face went pale as a terrible realization dawned upon him. Don Ricardo's mind traveled back 6 months, to a time before Relampago had fallen ill, before the desperate search for a cure had begun. It was a memory he had tried to bury, one that filled him with shame and regret every time it surfaced. But now, looking into the earnest eyes of this strange boy who seemed to understand things that grown men could not, he knew he could no longer hide from the truth. "There was a mare," Don Ricardo began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Estrella. She was not a valuable horse by any measure, just a simple brown mare that had been on the estate for years. But Relampago loved her. From the moment he arrived here as a young stallion, he was drawn to her. They were inseparable, always together in the pasture, always standing side by side. I used to watch them and marvel at their bond." The old man paused, struggling to continue. The crowd had grown completely silent, straining to hear every word. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if the very earth was holding its breath. 6 months ago, Don Ricardo continued, a wealthy buyer came to the estate. He wanted to purchase several horses for his daughter, who was learning to ride. I showed him the finest animals I had, but he was not interested in any of them. Instead, he noticed Estrella grazing in the far pasture. He said she had a gentle spirit, that she would be perfect for a beginner. He offered me a price that was far more than she was worth. Don Ricardo's voice cracked, and he had to stop for a moment to compose himself. Mateo waited patiently, his hand still resting on Relampago's neck, feeling the horse's heartbeat beneath his fingers. "I sold her," Don Ricardo finally admitted, the words coming out in a rush, as if he could not bear to hold them inside any longer. I sold Estrella without a second thought. She was just a common mare, worth nothing compared to my other horses. I did not even consider what it would do to Relampago. I did not think he would care. After all, he was a champion, a purebred stallion worth more than most men earn in a lifetime. Why would he mourn a simple mare? But he did mourn, Mateo said softly. It was not a question. Don Ricardo nodded, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. The day she left, Relampago ran to the fence and watched the trailer disappear down the road. He stood there for hours, refusing to move, refusing to eat. I thought he would get over it in a few days. I thought he would forget, but he never did. He stopped eating properly, stopped running in the pastures, stopped being the horse he once was, and then he got sick. The confession hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy with the weight of guilt and regret. Around the corral, the assembled crowd exchanged glances of understanding. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others nodded with sympathy. They were farmers and ranchers, people who worked with animals every day. Many of them had made similar mistakes, had underestimated the depth of feeling that the animals were capable of. But few had paid such a devastating price. Mateo listened to Don Ricardo's story without judgment. His grandmother had taught him that everyone made mistakes, that what mattered was not the error itself, but what you did to make it right. He looked at Relampago, at the magnificent stallion who had been laid low not by disease but by heartbreak, and he understood what needed to be done. "You have to find her," Mateo said simply. "You have to bring Estrella back." Don Ricardo looked at the boy with wide eyes. "But I do not even know where she is," he protested. "The buyer was from far away, somewhere in the north. He could have taken her anywhere. She could be hundreds of miles from here by now." "Then you must search," Mateo replied firmly. "You must do whatever it takes to find her and bring her home. It is the only way to heal Relampago's spirit. Without her, he will continue to fade, no matter how many herbs I give him or how many prayers I say." The old man stared at the boy for a long moment, a war of emotions playing across his face. Finding Estrella would be an enormous undertaking. It would require resources, time, and effort that seemed almost impossible to justify for a horse that was worth so little in monetary terms. But as he looked at Relampago lying in the dust, as he remembered all the joy and pride this stallion had brought him over the years, he knew that there was no choice. If there was even a chance that Mateo was right, he had to try. "I will find her," Don Ricardo declared, rising to his feet with a newfound determination. "I will send my men to every corner of the country if I have to. I will not rest until Estrella is back where she belongs." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Whatever skepticism they had felt toward Mateo was rapidly fading, replaced by admiration for this young boy who had seen what no one else could see. The veterinarians who had pronounced Relampago's case hopeless exchanged uncomfortable glances, forced to confront the possibility that their scientific expertise had missed something fundamental. But even as Don Ricardo began issuing orders to his workers, organizing search parties, and making phone calls to contacts throughout the region, Mateo knew that time was running out. Relampago was stronger than he had been an hour ago, but he was still desperately weak. The herbs would sustain him for a while, but they could not replace what he had lost. Finding Estrella could take days, weeks, even months, and Mateo was not sure the stallion had that much time left. He leaned close to Relampago's ear once more, stroking the horse's mane with gentle fingers. "Hold on," he whispered. "She is coming back to you, I promise. Just hold on a little longer." The horse's eyes flickered open, meeting Mateo's gaze with an intensity that sent shivers down the boy's spine. In that look, Mateo saw everything: the love, the loss, the desperate hope that refused to die. And he made a silent vow that he would do everything in his power to honor that hope, to bring Estrella home and heal this broken heart. The search for the lost mare had begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity on the Montoya estate. Don Ricardo transformed from a man paralyzed by grief into a force of nature, directing his considerable resources toward a single goal. He dispatched riders to every village within 50 miles, sent telegrams to business associates across the country, and offered a substantial reward for any information about Estrella's whereabouts. The search for a common brown mare had become the most important mission of his life. Meanwhile, Mateo remained by Relampago's side, refusing to leave even when Don Ricardo offered him a comfortable bed in the main house. The boy slept in the stable, curled up in the hay beside the stallion, waking every few hours to check on his patient and administer more of his grandmother's remedies. He had sent word back to his village, asking for additional herbs to be brought to him, and a steady stream of supplies began arriving from the mountains. The bond between Mateo and Relampago grew stronger with each passing day. The horse, who had been too weak to lift his head when the boy first arrived, was now able to stand for short periods with assistance. His appetite had returned, and though he ate slowly and without enthusiasm, he was eating nonetheless. The veterinarians who had declared his case hopeless watched these developments with amazement, unable to explain how a child with no formal training had accomplished what their advanced medicine could not. But Mateo knew that the improvement was fragile, a temporary reprieve rather than a true recovery. Each night, when the estate grew quiet and the stars emerged overhead, he could feel Relampago's spirit struggling against the weight of his sorrow. The stallion would lift his head and gaze toward the horizon, his ears pricked forward as if listening for hoofbeats that never came. In those moments, Mateo understood that no amount of herbs or care could substitute for what the horse truly needed. On the 5th day of the search, a messenger arrived with news that sent ripples of excitement through the estate. One of Don Ricardo's contacts had traced the buyer to a ranch near the northern border, nearly 300 miles away. The man remembered selling Estrella to another buyer just 2 months after purchasing her, claiming that his daughter had lost interest in riding. The trail had gone cold after that, but it was a lead, the first real hope they had received. Don Ricardo wasted no time. He assembled a team of his best riders and prepared to make the journey north himself. Before leaving, he knelt beside Mateo in the stable, placing a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. "You have given me hope when I had none," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens, I will never forget what you have done for Relampago, for me." Mateo looked up at Don Ricardo with solemn eyes. "Find her," he said simply. "That is all the thanks I need." The old man nodded and rose to his feet. He took one last look at Relampago, who was standing in his stall with his head lowered, and made a silent promise to his beloved horse. Then he mounted his own stallion and led his men out of the estate, disappearing down the dusty road in a cloud of hooves and determination. The days stretched into a week, and still there was no word from Don Ricardo. Mateo continued his vigil, his small body growing thin from lack of proper food and rest. The workers on the estate tried to convince him to take better care of himself, but the boy refused to be distracted from his purpose. He had made a promise to Relampago, and he would keep it no matter the cost. Joaquin, the old foreman who had served the Montoya family for decades, took a special interest in the boy. He brought Mateo meals from the main kitchen, sat with him in the evenings, and shared stories about the estate and its history. He told Mateo about Don Ricardo's wife, a beautiful woman named Isabella, who had died 5 years ago from an illness that no doctor could cure. He explained that Relampago had been Isabella's favorite horse, that she used to spend hours grooming him and riding through the pastures. When she died, Don Ricardo had transferred all his love and attention to the stallion, as if keeping Relampago alive was a way of keeping her memory alive too. "That is why this horse means so much to him," Joaquin said one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Relampago is not just an animal to Don Ricardo. He is a connection to the woman he loved more than life itself. Losing this horse would be like losing her all over again." Mateo absorbed this information in silence, feeling the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on his young shoulders. He had come to this estate seeking to help a dying horse, but he now understood that the stakes were much higher than he had realized. He was not just fighting to save Relampago. He was fighting to save Don Ricardo, too, to protect an old man from a grief that might finally destroy him. On the 10th day, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping toward the estate at full speed. Mateo's heart leaped into his throat as he recognized one of the men who had departed with Don Ricardo. The rider pulled his horse to a stop in the courtyard, his face flushed with exhaustion, but split by a wide grin. "We found her," the man announced breathlessly. "We found Estrella. Don Ricardo is bringing her home." The news spread through the estate like wildfire. Workers emerged from barns and fields, gathering in the courtyard to celebrate and speculate. But Mateo did not join them. Instead, he ran to the stable where Relampago waited, bursting through the door with tears streaming down his face. "She is coming," he told the horse, throwing his arms around the stallion's neck. "Estrella is coming home. You just have to hold on a little longer. Can you do that for me?" Relampago lifted his head higher than he had in days, his ears pricking forward with an alertness that had been absent since Mateo first arrived. The horse let out a soft whinny, a sound that seemed to carry all the hope and longing that words could never express. And Mateo knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason, that Relampago had understood. The waiting was almost over. The next 2 days were the longest of Mateo's young life. Every hour felt like an eternity as he waited for Don Ricardo to return with Estrella. He spent most of his time in the stable with Relampago, talking to the horse in a low, soothing voice, telling him stories about his village and his grandmother and the mountains where he had grown up. The stallion seemed to listen intently, his dark eyes following Mateo's every movement, his ears swiveling toward the sound of the boy's voice. Something had changed in Relampago since the news of Estrella's discovery. The spark of life that had been flickering weakly in his eyes now burned brighter, fueled by a hope that no medicine could provide. He was eating more, standing longer, and even took a few tentative steps around his stall when Mateo encouraged him. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. The horse was fighting again, clinging to life with a determination that moved everyone who witnessed it. The workers on the estate found excuses to pass by this stable, peeking in to check on Relampago's progress. Many of them had known the horse since he was a young colt, had watched him grow into a champion that brought glory to the Montoya name. They had mourned when he fell ill and had resigned themselves to losing him. But now, thanks to the strange boy who had appeared from nowhere, they dared to hope again. On the morning of the 12th day, a shout went up from the watchtower at the edge of the estate. Riders approaching from the north, the lookout called down, "It is Don Ricardo. He has returned." Mateo's heart began to race as he led Relampago out of the stable into the warm morning sunshine. The stallion moved slowly, his legs still weak from weeks of illness, but there was a new energy in his step that had not been there before. He lifted his head and sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring as if searching for a familiar scent. The procession that approached the estate was a sight to behold. Don Ricardo rode at the front, his posture straight and proud, despite the exhaustion that lined his face. Behind him came his men, their horses dusty and tired from the long journey. And at the center of the group, led by a gentle rope, walked a brown mare whose unremarkable appearance belied her extraordinary importance. Estrella was not a beautiful horse by any conventional standard. Her coat was plain, her mane tangled and unkempt from weeks of neglect. She was smaller than the other horses on the estate, her frame compact and sturdy rather than elegant. But when Relampago saw her, he let out a sound that made everyone present stop in their tracks. It was not quite a whinny and not quite a cry. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the stallion's soul. Relampago pulled against Mateo's grip, straining toward the approaching mare with a strength that surprised everyone who had witnessed his weakness just days before. His entire body trembled with emotion, his eyes fixed on Estrella as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Estrella heard the sound and raised her head sharply. For a moment she seemed confused, uncertain of where she was or what was happening. But then her eyes found Relampago, and something in her expression shifted. She let out an answering call, high and clear, and began pulling against her own rope, desperate to reach the stallion who had been her companion for so many years. Don Ricardo quickly dismounted and took the rope from his rider's hands. He led Estrella forward, his weathered face wet with tears that he made no effort to hide. The crowd that had gathered parted to let them through, watching in awed silence as the two horses drew closer to each other. Matteo released his grip on Relampago's halter, stepping back to give the stallion room. He did not need to guide him anymore. Relampago knew exactly where he needed to go. With steps that grew stronger and surer with each passing second, the great chestnut stallion walked toward his lost love. When they finally reached each other, Relampago and Estrella stood nose to nose, their breath mingling in the cool morning air. For a long moment, neither horse moved. They simply stood there, drinking in each other's presence, reconnecting after months of painful separation. Then Estrella let out a soft nicker and pressed her head against Relampago's neck, and the stallion responded by draping his own neck over hers in an embrace that needed no translation. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Matteo barely heard them. He was watching the two horses with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the power of what he was witnessing. He had believed in the healing power of love his entire life, had seen it work miracles in his grandmother's hands, but never had he seen anything quite like this. Never had he witnessed a broken heart being mended so completely, so beautifully. Don Ricardo approached Matteo and knelt down beside him, placing both hands on the boy's thin shoulders. "You did this," the old man said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saw what no one else could see. You gave my horse a reason to live again." Matteo shook his head modestly. "I only showed you where to look," he replied. "You are the one who brought her back. You are the one who made this possible." The old man smiled through his tears, a genuine smile that seemed to take years off his weathered face. "Then we did it together," he said, "and I will never forget it as long as I live." Around them, the celebration continued. Workers embraced each other, laughing and crying at the same time. The veterinarians who had declared Relampago's case hopeless stood in stunned silence, forced to confront the limitations of their scientific understanding. And in the center of it all, Relampago and Estrella remained locked in their embrace, two souls reunited after a separation that had nearly cost one of them his life. But Matteo knew that the healing was not yet complete. Relampago was stronger than he had been, but he was still far from recovered. The road ahead would be long and difficult, requiring patience, care, and an unwavering commitment to the stallion's well-being. The real work was only just beginning. The weeks that followed Estrella's return were a time of transformation on the Montoya estate. Relampago's recovery, which had seemed impossible just days before, progressed with a speed that astonished everyone who witnessed it. The stallion, who had lain dying in the dust, now spent his days in the pasture with Estrella, grazing peacefully at her side, his strength returning with each passing hour. The bond between the two horses was a constant source of wonder, a living testament to the power of connection and love. Matteo remained on the estate, though his role had shifted from healer to caretaker. He rose each morning before dawn to prepare Relampago's special mixture of herbs, a recipe his grandmother had refined over generations, to promote the strength and vitality. He spent hours grooming both horses, running his small hands through their manes and speaking to them in the gentle voice that had become his trademark. The animals responded to him with a trust and affection that the other workers could only marvel at. Don Ricardo watched the boy with growing admiration and something else, something that felt almost like paternal love. The old man had never had children of his own, a source of deep regret that he rarely spoke of. His wife Isabella had longed for a family, but the years had passed without blessing them with offspring. Now, watching Matteo move among the horses with such natural grace and wisdom, Don Ricardo found himself imagining what it might have been like to have a son. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, Don Ricardo found Matteo sitting on the fence of the pasture, watching Relampago and Estrella graze in the fading light. The old man climbed up beside him, his joints protesting the effort, and sat in companionable silence for several minutes. "You have a gift," Don Ricardo finally said, his voice soft with wonder. "I have known many people who work with animals, veterinarians and trainers and healers of all kinds, but I have never met anyone who understands them the way you do. It is as if you can see into their very souls." Matteo shrugged modestly, his eyes never leaving the horses. "My grandmother says that all living things speak the same language," he replied. We just have to learn how to listen. Most people are too busy talking to hear what the animals are trying to tell them." Don Ricardo nodded thoughtfully, considering the boy's words. "Your grandmother sounds like a very wise woman," he said. "I would like to meet her someday." "She would like that," Mateo said with a small smile. "She does not travel much anymore. Her legs are not as strong as they used to be, but she would be happy to know that her teachings helped save Relampago." The old man fell silent again, wrestling with thoughts that had been building inside him for days. Finally, he turned to face Mateo directly, his expression serious but kind. "I made a promise," he said slowly. "I announced to the world that whoever could cure my horse would inherit my entire estate. Do you remember?" Mateo nodded, though he seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I remember," he said quietly. "But I did not come here for your estate. I came because I heard a horse was suffering, and I thought I might be able to help." Don Ricardo smiled, unsurprised by the boy's response. It was exactly what he had expected from someone with such a pure heart. Nevertheless, he continued the conversation. "I remember," he said quietly. "But I did not come here for your estate. I came because I heard a horse was suffering, and I thought I might be able to help." Don Ricardo smiled, unsurprised by the boy's response. It was exactly what he had expected from someone with such a pure heart. Nevertheless, he continued, "A promise is a promise. I'm a man of my word, and I will not go back on what I said. This estate, everything I own, it belongs to you now." Mateo's eyes went wide with shock. "But I am just a boy," he protested. "I do not know anything about running an estate or managing businesses. I would not know what to do with all of this." The old man chuckled softly. "You would not have to do anything alone," he assured the boy. "I am not planning to disappear. I would stay and help you, teach you everything I know, and when you are older, when you are ready, you would take over completely. But the estate would be yours, legally and officially. That is what I promised, and that is what I intend to deliver." Mateo sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. Just weeks ago, he had been a poor boy from a tiny village, with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back and his grandmother's teachings. Now, one of the wealthiest men in the region was offering him everything. "Pure offer," Mateo said slowly, his young voice steady and sure, "but only on one condition." Don Ricardo raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Name it," he said. Mateo turned to face the old man, his dark eyes shining with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "I want to turn this estate into a sanctuary," he said, "a place where animals who have been abandoned or mistreated can come to heal. I want to help other creatures the way I helped Relampago. That is the only way I will accept your gift." For a long moment, Don Ricardo simply stared at the boy, overwhelmed by the purity of his request. In all his years of business dealings, he had never encountered anyone who would turn down a fortune in favor of something so selfless. It was a humbling reminder of how far he himself had strayed from the values that truly mattered. Then the old man began to laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to shake loose years of accumulated sorrow and regret. "My boy," he said, wiping tears of joy from his eyes, "you have yourself a deal. We will build the finest animal sanctuary this country has ever seen, together." Mateo smiled, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just a wealthy landowner and a poor village boy. They were partners, united by a common purpose that transcended wealth and status. They were family. The transformation of the Montoya estate began almost immediately. Don Ricardo, energized by a sense of purpose he had not felt in years, threw himself into the project with the same passion he had once reserved for building his business empire. Workers were hired, architects were consulted, and plans were drawn up for new facilities that would house animals of all kinds. The main stable was expanded to accommodate more horses, while separate areas were designated for cattle, goats, donkeys, and other creatures that might need refuge. Mateo worked alongside Don Ricardo every step of the way, offering suggestions and insights that consistently impressed the older man. Despite his youth, the boy possessed an intuitive understanding of what animals needed to thrive. He insisted that each enclosure be designed with the creature's natural behavior in mind. with plenty of space to roam and socialize. He recommended specific plants to be grown in the pastures, herbs that would promote health and well-being. And he spent hours training the workers in his grandmother's methods, teaching them how to read the subtle signs of distress or illness that most people overlooked. Word of the sanctuary spread quickly throughout the region. Farmers who could no longer care for aging livestock brought their animals to the estate, knowing they would be treated with dignity and respect. Travelers who found abandoned creatures along the roads delivered them to the gates, trusting that they would find a safe haven within. Even some of the wealthy landowners who had once looked down on Mateo began sending their unwanted animals to the sanctuary, grateful for a place where they could ease their consciences without having to dirty their own hands. Among the first animals to arrive was a donkey named Pepito, whose legs had been damaged in an accident that left him unable to work. His previous owner had been planning to sell him for meat when he heard about the sanctuary and decided to give the creature a second chance. Mateo took a special interest in Pepito, spending hours massaging his legs with healing oils and walking him slowly around the paddock to rebuild his strength. Within a month, the donkey was able to move without pain, and he became one of the most beloved residents of the sanctuary. There was also a blind goat named Luna, who had been abandoned by her herd because she could not keep up during migrations. Mateo created a special enclosure for her near the main house, where she could hear the sounds of daily activity and feel connected to the life around her. He assigned one of the younger workers to be her companion, leading her to food and water and protecting her from obstacles she could not see. Luna flourished under this care, her gentle bleating becoming a familiar soundtrack to life on the estate. But of all the animals at the sanctuary, none held a more special place than Relampago and Estrella. The two horses had become the heart and soul of the operation, living symbols of what love and dedication could accomplish. Visitors who came to the estate always asked to see them first, and Mateo was happy to share their story with anyone who would listen. He believed that their tale had the power to change hearts, to show people that animals were capable of emotions just as deep and complex as those of humans. Mateo's grandmother finally made the journey to visit the estate 3 months after the sanctuary opened. She arrived on a cart driven by a neighbor, her frail body wrapped in colorful shawls against the chill of the mountain air. When she saw what her grandson had accomplished, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. She embraced Mateo tightly, whispering words of pride and love that he would treasure for the rest of his life. Don Ricardo welcomed the old woman into his home with the reverence due to a queen. He insisted that she stay in the finest guest room, with servants to attend to her every need. But Mateo's grandmother was a simple woman who had no use for luxury. She preferred to spend her time in the stables and pastures, observing the animals and offering quiet advice to the workers who cared for them. Her presence seemed to elevate the entire estate, as if her wisdom and kindness were spreading through the air like a healing fragrance. One afternoon, Mateo found his grandmother sitting beside Relampago in the pasture, her gnarled hand resting on the stallion's neck. The horse stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed in contentment, his breath slow and peaceful. Estrella grazed nearby, occasionally lifting her head to check on her companion. The scene was so tranquil, so perfect, that Mateo hesitated to disturb it, but his grandmother sensed his presence and beckoned him forward. "Come," she said softly, "sit with us." Mateo settled onto the grass beside her, leaning against Relampago's warm flank. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat. "Come," she said softly, "sit with us." Mateo settled onto the grass beside her, leaning against Relampago's warm flank. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together, surrounded by the sounds of the sanctuary, the bleating of goats, the braying of donkeys, the distant laughter of workers going about their tasks. "You have done well," his grandmother finally said. "Better than I ever imagined. When I taught you about healing, I never dreamed you would create something like this. You have given so many creatures a second chance at life." Mateo smiled but shook his head modestly. "I only did what you taught me," he replied. "Everything I know I learned from you." His grandmother chuckled softly, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I taught you the methods," she acknowledged. but the heart, the compassion, the courage to act when others would look away, that came from within you, that is something that cannot be taught. It can only be nurtured. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes bright with love and pride. You were born with a gift, Mateo, a gift for understanding the suffering of others and knowing how to ease it. Promise me that you will never stop using it. Promise me that no matter how successful you become, no matter how much wealth or power you accumulate, you'll never forget. Relampago let out a soft whinny, as if adding his own voice to the vow. And in the golden light of the afternoon sun, surrounded by the creatures he had dedicated his life to helping, Mateo felt a peace settle over him that he knew would last forever. Years passed, like leaves carried on the wind, each season bringing new changes to the sanctuary that Mateo and Don Ricardo had built together. The estate that had once been known only for its champion racehorses now gained fame for something far more meaningful: its compassion for all creatures great and small. People traveled from distant provinces to see the sanctuary, to witness firsthand the miracle that had begun with a dying stallion and a barefoot boy who refused to give up. Mateo grew from a child into a young man, his body lengthening and strengthening with each passing year. But his eyes retained the same gentle wisdom they had always held, that remarkable ability to see into the hearts of animals and understand their deepest needs. He became known throughout the region as the horse whisperer of Montoya, though those who knew him well understood that his gifts extended far beyond horses. He could calm a frightened dog with a touch, soothe an injured bird with a song, and bring peace to any creature that crossed his path. Don Ricardo watched Mateo's transformation with the pride of a father observing his son. The old man had aged considerably since the day they first met, his hair now completely white, his steps slower and more deliberate. But his spirit remained strong, nourished by the purpose that Mateo had helped him discover. He spent his days overseeing the business operations of the sanctuary, ensuring that there would always be enough resources to care for the animals who needed them most. Mateo's grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep during the third winter after the sanctuary opened. She had returned to her village after her visit, insisting that she belonged among her own people, despite Mateo's pleas for her to stay. When the news reached the estate, Mateo disappeared into the pastures for 3 days, grieving in the company of the animals who understood his sorrow without needing words. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red, but his spirit was calm. "She is with me still," he told Don Ricardo quietly. "Everything she taught me, everything she believed in, it lives on in this place. As long as the sanctuary exists, she will never truly be gone." Relampago and Estrella remained inseparable throughout the years, their bond as strong as it had been on the day of their reunion. The great chestnut stallion never raced again, but he did not need to. His purpose now was simply to live, to enjoy each day in the company of the mare he loved and the boy who had saved his life. Visitors often found them standing together in the same spot where they had first embraced, their heads close, their breath mingling in the cool morning air. On the 10th anniversary of the sanctuary's founding, Don Ricardo called Mateo into his study for a private conversation. The old man was approaching his 80th year now, and though his mind remained sharp, his body had grown frail. He sat behind the same desk where he had once managed his business empire, but the papers before him now concerned a different kind of legacy entirely. "I have completed the legal arrangements," Don Ricardo said, sliding a stack of documents across the desk toward Mateo. "The estate is officially yours now, along with all the resources needed to keep the sanctuary running for generations to come. I have also established a foundation in your name, funded by investments that will grow over time. No matter what happens to me, this place will continue." Mateo took the papers but did not look at them. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on Don Ricardo's face, seeing the weariness there but also the contentment. "You have given me everything," he said softly. "How can I ever repay you?" Don Ricardo smiled, the expression carving deep lines into his weathered face. "You already have," he replied. "When you walked into that corral 10 years ago, I was a man who had lost everything that mattered. My wife was gone, my horse was dying, and I had nothing left to live for. You showed me that there was still meaning to be found, still good to be done, You gave me a reason to keep going. That is worth more than any estate." The old man rose slowly from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out at the pastures where animals of all kinds grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. "I used to measure my success by the trophies on my walls and the money in my accounts," he continued. "But now I understand that true success is measured differently. It is measured by the lives you touch, the suffering you ease, the love you give and receive. By that measure, these last 10 years have been the most successful of my life." Matteo joined him at the window, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had become like a father to him. In the distance he could see Relampago and Estrella, still together after all these years, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. The sight filled him with a warmth that no words could describe. Don Ricardo passed away peacefully the following spring, surrounded by the people and animals he loved. Matteo was at his bedside when he drew his final breath, holding the old man's hand, just as he had once held Relampago's halter on that fateful day so many years ago. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, farmers and businessmen, workers and wanderers, all united in their grief for a man who had touched their lives in countless ways. But the sanctuary lived on, just as Don Ricardo had intended. Matteo continued to welcome every creature in need, to heal every broken body and mend every wounded spirit that found its way to his door. He married a kind woman from a neighboring village who shared his love for animals, and together they raised children who carried on the tradition of compassion that had begun with a simple act of courage. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the animals were settled for the night, Matteo would walk out to the pasture where 2 weathered gravestones stood side by side, marking the final resting places of Relampago and Estrella. He would sit between them, just as he had sat with them in life, and he would remember. He would remember the boy who raised his hand when everyone else had given up. He would remember the horse whose heart was healed by love. And he would remember that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world forever.